I've spent my entire life studying patterns, tracking the movement of air masses, watching the dance of pressure systems, predicting the collision of warm and cold fronts. But nothing in my 20-year career as a meteorologist prepared me for the storm system that Chase Duvall brought into my life. It's been exactly 1 year since the day he walked into my weather station, and I'm still trying to understand the atmospheric conditions that allowed a 46-year-old woman who had given up on love to fall so completely for a man 11 years her junior. "There's someone here about the Vermilion Cliffs documentary," she said, her voice tinny through the old intercom. "Says he emailed about weather patterns?" I vaguely remembered an email from a videographer requesting historical weather data for a conservation project. I'd agreed, partly because environmental advocacy aligns with my personal values, and partly because I rarely turn down an opportunity to talk about meteorology with someone who seems genuinely interested. "Send him back," I replied, quickly minimizing the dating app I'd been half-heartedly scrolling through during my lunch break. 3 months on 3 different apps, and I'd yet to find someone who didn't either bore me to tears or send me running for the hills after the first meeting. My friends insisted I was being too picky. Maybe they were right, but after 8 years with Derek, 8 years of having my interests belittled, my achievements diminished, my friendships systematically dismantled, I'd rather be alone than settle for less than I deserved. I heard him before I saw him, a deep, melodious laugh responding to something Margot had said, the kind of genuine laugh that makes others want to join in. When he rounded the corner into the weather center, I was struck first by his height, several inches taller than my own 5'10", and then by the intensity of his gaze as those startling blue eyes locked onto mine. "Dr. Hawthorne?" He crossed the room in a few easy strides, hand extended. "Chase Duvall, thanks for agreeing to meet with me." His grip was firm, his palm calloused in a way that spoke of outdoor work rather than offices. Up close, I noticed the sun lines around his eyes, the slight chapping of his lips from exposure to the elements, the easy confidence in his posture. He looked younger than I'd expected from his emails, mid-30s perhaps, and carried himself with an energy that immediately made our weather center feel more alive. "Linda, please," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Dr. Hawthorne makes me feel like I should be giving a lecture on barometric pressure." "Could you?" He grinned as he settled into the chair, placing a sleek laptop on the edge of my desk. "Give a lecture on barometric pressure, I mean, because that's actually not far off from what I'm hoping to pick your brain about." For the next hour, I found myself explaining the unique weather patterns of northern Arizona, how the elevation affects precipitation, how the canyons create their own wind systems, how the interplay between desert floor and mountain peak produces some of the most dramatic weather events in the American Southwest. Chase listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions that revealed he'd done his research before arriving. "The way you describe weather systems," he said as I pulled up a 3D visualization of air currents over the Vermilion Cliffs, "it's like you're talking about a living entity, like these patterns have personality." I felt myself flush slightly at his observation. Derek had always mocked what he called my weird weather personification thing, claiming it was unprofessional and childish. But Chase was leaning forward, eyes alight with fascination. "They do, in a way," I admitted. "Each system has its own signature, I guess you could say. Some are predictable, methodical. Others are volatile, impulsive. When you track them long enough, you start to recognize their behaviors." "Like people," Chase suggested. "Exactly like people," I agreed, surprised by his insight, though weather is often easier to predict. His laugh caught me off guard, deep and genuine, crinkling the corners of those impossibly blue eyes. "Based on my dating history, I'd have to agree with you there." The casual comment created an unexpected moment of connection between us. I found myself curious about that dating history, about what kind of woman would capture the attention of someone like Chase Duvall. But I reminded myself that this was a professional meeting, and he was likely just making conversation. "What exactly are you documenting at the cliffs?" I asked, steering us back to safer territory. He ran a hand through his wavy chestnut hair, which I noticed was sun-streaked at the ends. "The impact of climate change on the geological formations and wildlife habitats," I'm working with the Arizona Conservation Alliance to create a series that makes the science accessible to the general public. He pulled up some footage on his laptop, stunning aerial shots of the red rock formations, captured by drone at different times of day. The drone work is mine, he explained, as I watched the sweeping views of canyons and cliffs. But I need to understand the weather dynamics to explain how erosion patterns are changing with the more extreme conditions we're seeing. As he spoke about his project, the passion evident in his voice, the deep concern for the environment clear in his choice of words, I found myself drawn in not just by the content, but by his presence. There was something magnetic about his energy, something that made me forget the 11-year age gap that my brain had automatically calculated when I'd pegged him as mid-30s. What was meant to be a brief consulting meeting stretched into the afternoon. We moved from discussing weather patterns to sharing our personal connections to the landscapes he was documenting. I told him about my weekend trail runs through the Ponderosa forests, about the sculptures I created, inspired by rock formations and cloud patterns. He described the feeling of hanging from a cliff face at dawn, watching the first light transform the red rocks from deep burgundy to fiery orange. "You should come out with me sometime," he said as he finally packed up his laptop, hours later than either of us had planned. "To Sedona. See the formations up close while I'm filming. The perspective from the ground adds context to the drone footage." The invitation caught me off guard. Was this professional collaboration or something more? I hadn't navigated these waters in so long that I couldn't tell if I was misreading signals. "I'd like that," I heard myself say, surprising us both perhaps. For the project, it would be helpful to see the sights firsthand. "For the project," he echoed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Of course. How's your schedule this weekend?" And just like that, I found myself agreeing to meet an essentially strange man in the wilderness 2 days later. As I watched him walk away, noting the confident set of his shoulders, the easy grace in his movements, I wondered what atmospheric anomaly had just blown through my carefully organized life. I spent an embarrassing amount of time that Saturday morning deciding what to wear. My closet, full of practical outdoor gear and professional weather center attire, suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. I settled on hiking pants that I knew flattered my long legs, a moisture-wicking tank top in a blue that brought out my eyes, and a light flannel to guard against the morning chill. I left my sandy blonde hair loose, instead of in its usual work ponytail, then immediately questioned the practicality of that decision for a hike. The drive to our meeting point near Sedona took me through familiar scenery that nevertheless never fails to stir something profound in my spirit. As the landscape transformed from the pine forests of Flagstaff to the dramatic red rock country, I felt the usual sense of awe, but today it was tinged with a flutter of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. Chase was waiting at the trailhead, leaning against a rugged Jeep with a drone case at his feet. He straightened when he saw my car approach, lifting a hand in greeting. The morning sun lit him from behind, turning his chestnut hair golden at the edges. When I stepped out of my car, his smile was warm enough to rival the Arizona sun. "You made it," he said, as if he'd been genuinely concerned I might change my mind. "I'm a meteorologist," I replied, with a lightness I didn't entirely feel. "We're pathologically punctual. The weather waits for no one." He laughed, that rich sound I'd been replaying in my mind for 2 days, and gestured toward the trail. "The light waits for no one either. We should get moving if we want to catch the formations in the best morning glow." The hike was moderate by my standards, but challenging enough to require concentration. Chase moved with the easy confidence of someone intimately familiar with the terrain, occasionally reaching back to offer me a hand over the more technical sections, not because I needed help, but with a casual courtesy that suggested he'd do the same for anyone, regardless of gender or ability. We reached a plateau just as the sun crested high enough to illuminate the vast expanse of red rock formations spread before us. The landscape was otherworldly, spires and buttes rising from the earth like cathedral architecture, sculpted by wind and water over millennia. The air was still cool, carrying the scent of juniper and sage, and perfectly clear in that way unique to desert elevations. This is where science meets spirituality for me, Chase said quietly, as we stood absorbing the vista. I can understand all the geological processes that created this landscape, but that knowledge doesn't diminish the sense of wonder. His words resonated deeply with me. As a scientist, I'd often found myself defending the position that understanding natural phenomena enhances, rather than diminishes, their beauty. That's how I feel about weather, I admitted. Knowing the physics behind a thunderstorm doesn't make the experience of watching lightning split the sky any less magical. He turned to look at me then, his expression thoughtful. That's exactly it. The understanding deepens the appreciation. His gaze held mine for a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to the view. This is why I do what I do. I want people to see these places, really see them, understand what's at stake if we don't protect them. As the morning progressed, I watched Chase work with his drone, his focus intense as he directed the small aircraft through precise flight patterns to capture the landscape from multiple angles. Between flights, we talked about our work, about the environment, about the small details of our lives that gradually painted a fuller picture of who we each were. I learned that he lived simply in a small house outside Sedona, that he'd renovated himself, that he'd left a corporate job in Phoenix 5 years ago to pursue environmental activism and documentary work, that he'd been in a 4-year relationship with a woman who had ultimately chosen career advancement in New York over building a life with him in Arizona. She couldn't understand why anyone would choose rocks and sky over opportunity and culture, he explained as we shared the lunch he'd packed, hummus wraps and fresh fruit. And I couldn't understand choosing concrete and crowds over this. He gestured to the panorama before us. It's not always an either-or, I found myself saying. I've built a career I love while still maintaining my connection to the natural world. That's what attracted me to your work, he said, his gaze direct. When I was researching meteorologists in the area, I read that article you published about using weather data to help conservation efforts. You found balance. I felt a flush of pleasure at his words, at the validation of life choices I'd fought hard to make. After my divorce from Derek, I deliberately shaped a life that honored both my professional ambitions and my need for connection to the land I loved. Having that recognized by someone who shared similar values felt unexpectedly affirming. As the afternoon light began to soften, Chase suggested we move to a different location to capture the sunset effects on the western faces of the formations. The second hike was shorter but steeper, leading us to an outcropping that offered a panoramic view of the valley. As we settled onto a flat rock to wait for the optimal light, our conversation shifted to more personal territory. You mentioned a divorce, Chase said, his tone careful, giving me space to deflect if I wanted to. Recent? 3 years finalized, I replied, surprised at my willingness to discuss it. 11 years together in total. One of those relationships that should have ended much sooner than it did. What kept you in it? His question wasn't prurient, just genuinely curious. I considered my answer carefully, looking out over the landscape that was beginning to glow with amber light as the sun descended. Inertia, partly. Fear of starting over in my 40s. And hope, I suppose. That persistent, somewhat irrational belief that people can change, that situations can improve if you just try hard enough. Chase nodded thoughtfully. Hope can be both the most beautiful and most destructive force in relationships. He glanced at me, a rueful smile playing at his lips. I stayed in my last relationship a year longer than I should have, hoping Alexis would suddenly discover a passion for southwestern landscapes instead of Manhattan galleries. And I kept thinking Derek would develop respect for my career, instead of seeing it as a cute hobby I'd eventually abandon to focus on being his wife. I added, with a wry laugh. We're quite the optimists. Or gluttons for punishment, Chase suggested, but his tone was light. As the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, Chase set up his drone for one last flight. I watched him work, his hands confident on the controls, his expression intensely focused, occasionally breaking into a satisfied smile when he captured exactly the shot he wanted. There was something deeply attractive about his combination of passion and competence, about the way he engaged so fully with his craft. The sunset itself was spectacular, the kind of technicolor display that Arizona is famous for, painting the red rocks in shades of fire and blood orange, while the sky progressed through a palette of gold to magenta to deep indigo. We stood in companionable silence, watching the transformation of light and land, until the first stars began to appear in the eastern sky. "Worth the hike?" Chase asked, as we finally packed up his equipment. "Worth every step," I replied, meaning it more broadly than just the physical journey. The walk back to the trailhead was darker, guided by our headlamps and the emerging starlight. Chase pointed out constellations as they appeared, revealing a knowledge of astronomy that matched my own interest in the night sky. "There's a meteor shower next weekend," I found myself saying as we reached our vehicles. "The Eta Aquarids. I usually drive out to a dark sky spot north of Flagstaff to watch. If you're interested." The invitation hung between us, more explicitly personal than our day together had been. Chase's expression, illuminated in the soft glow of our headlamps, was difficult to read. "I'd love to," he said finally, "but only if you let me bring the camping gear and breakfast provisions, fair exchange for your astronomical expertise." The week that followed was filled with anticipation that made me feel simultaneously younger than my years, and acutely aware of them. I checked the weather obsessively, not just professionally, but personally, relieved when the forecast remained clear for the meteor shower. I found myself taking extra care with my appearance at work, though I knew there was no chance of running into Chase at the station. I even spent an evening updating my pathetically neglected dating profile, only to delete the app entirely the next morning, confused by my own actions. The rational part of my brain kept reminding me that Chase was 35 to my 46, a gap that might mean nothing to him now, but could become significant as years passed. That we lived in different cities, had different careers, different life trajectories. That I was potentially setting myself up for disappointment by reading too much into what might simply be friendship or professional collaboration. But another part of me, a part that had been dormant during my marriage and the cautious years that followed my divorce, kept remembering the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the careful attention he gave when I spoke, the natural ease that had developed between us during our day in the Red Rocks. When Saturday arrived, bringing with it perfect conditions for meteor viewing, I packed my vehicle with perhaps too much care. Telescope, star charts, extra blankets against the desert night's chill, a thermos of the spiced tea I'd mentioned liking during our previous outing. I wore practical layers for the fluctuating temperatures, but chose fabrics that felt good against the skin, colors that I knew complemented my sun-kissed complexion and hazel eyes. Our meeting point was a remote area north of Flagstaff, far from city lights, where the high desert plateau opened to vast skies. Chase arrived shortly after I did, his Jeep raising a plume of dust on the dirt road that caught the golden light of late afternoon. He'd brought not just the promised camping gear, but a small portable fire pit that he assured me was permitted under the current fire restrictions. Setting up camp together felt oddly domestic, a comfortable division of tasks, as if we'd done this many times before. He assembled the fire pit and gathered fuel while I set up my telescope and oriented my star charts. By the time dusk descended, we had created a cozy outpost in the wilderness, a small blaze crackling in the fire pit, camping chairs positioned for optimal sky viewing, simple but delicious provisions laid out on a folding table. "I feel like I should apologize in advance for my enthusiasm," I said, as we settled in with mugs of hot cider, waiting for true darkness to fall. "I tend to get a bit intense about celestial events." Chase laughed, the sound melding with the crackling of the fire. "No apologies necessary. Your passion is one of the things I find most attractive about you." The straightforward compliment caught me off guard. Until that moment, there had been an unspoken ambiguity about our interactions. Friendly certainly, flirtatious possibly, but nothing explicitly stated. His words hung in the cooling air between us, an acknowledgement that this was, perhaps, more than either of us had initially intended. "One of the things?" I asked, surprising myself with my boldness. Even in the dim light of the fire, I could see his smile, slow and genuine. One of many, he confirmed. But maybe we should identify some constellations before I start listing them all and embarrass myself. The night deepened around us as I pointed out star patterns, explaining the mythology behind the constellations, while Chase listened with genuine interest. When the meteor shower began in earnest, bright streaks of light cutting across the velvety darkness, we fell silent, our faces turned upward in shared wonder. I don't know precisely when the mood shifted, when awareness of each other began to outweigh our attention to the sky. Only that at some point, I realized Chase had moved his chair closer to mine, that the space between us had diminished until I could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. "Linda," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the gentle crackling of the fire. When I turned to look at him, his expression was serious, his eyes reflecting pinpoints of starlight. "I should be clear about something." My heart stuttered in my chest, apprehension and anticipation mingling in equal measure. "What's that?" "This isn't just about weather patterns or documentaries or even meteor showers for me." His gaze was steady, direct. "I'm interested in you, not as a consultant or a colleague, but as a woman I find incredibly compelling." The simple honesty of his statement took my breath away. In the dating world I'd tentatively re-entered after my divorce, there had been so much game playing, so much strategic ambiguity. Chase's straightforwardness was as refreshing as it was terrifying. "I'm 11 years older than you," I said, the words falling from my lips before I could stop them. He nodded, unsurprised. "I know, I can do basic math." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Is that your only concern, or is there a longer list I should be addressing?" I laughed despite myself, the tension breaking slightly. "There might be a spreadsheet involved. I'm a scientist, after all." "Well, while you're consulting your data," he said, leaning slightly closer, "I'll just mention that I've dated women my age and found them perfectly lovely, but none of them have made me feel the way I do when I'm with you. None of them understand the things that matter most to me the way you seem to, instinctively." His words warmed something in me that had been cold for so long, I'd forgotten the sensation of its thawing. "And what things are those?" I asked softly. "The profound importance of wide-open spaces, the beauty in natural phenomena, the value of quiet observation." His eyes never left mine. "The courage it takes to start over when something isn't working, to redefine your life on your own terms." In that moment, under a sky streaked with meteors, I felt the careful walls I'd built around my heart begin to crumble. Chase reached across the small space between our chairs and took my hand, his palm warm against my fingers that had grown cold in the night air. "I'd like to kiss you," he said simply, "if that's something you want, too." The question, so direct, so respectful, undid me completely. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and then he was leaning toward me, closing the distance between us. His lips met mine with a gentleness that gradually gave way to something more urgent as I responded to his touch. His hand came up to cradle my face, fingers threading into my hair, and I felt myself leaning into him, drawn by a force as powerful and elemental as the weather systems I studied. When we finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, a meteor chose that perfect moment to streak across the sky directly above us, a brilliant flash of light that seemed to underscore the significance of what had just happened. "Good timing," Chase murmured, his forehead resting against mine. "A scientist would tell you it's just coincidence," I replied, my voice unsteady. "And what would Linda tell me?" His thumb traced the line of my cheekbone. I smiled in the darkness. "That sometimes the universe has a flair for the dramatic." That night beneath the meteor shower marked the beginning of something I hadn't dared hope for in my middle years. A relationship that felt both exhilarating and grounding, passionate and comfortable. The 3 months that followed were a gradual exploration of each other's lives, finding the places where they could mesh and negotiating the inevitable friction points. The geography was our first challenge, the 90-minute drive between Flagstaff and Sedona becoming a regular feature of our weekends. Chase had more flexibility with his freelance schedule and often drove up to spend evenings with me after I finished at the weather station. I adjusted my trail running routes to include Sedona paths, that let me end near his small house, where he would often be editing footage on his porch, ready to greet me with fresh iced tea and that smile that never failed to make my heart beat faster. We discovered shared interests beyond our love of the natural world, a mutual appreciation for obscure documentaries, similar taste in books, compatible approaches to health and fitness. But we also found differences that required compromise, his spontaneity sometimes clashing with my need for planning, my cautiousness occasionally frustrating his adventurous spirit. Our age gap, which had concerned me initially, rarely manifested as an issue between us. If anything, it often felt like Chase had an old soul, while my research-oriented career had kept me engaged with younger colleagues and current ideas. The only times I became acutely aware of our different life stages were when well-meaning friends made comments, or when I caught glimpses of our reflection in store windows and momentarily saw us through strangers' eyes. 4 months into our relationship, we faced our first significant challenge when Chase was offered a 3-month project documenting the effects of drought on the Colorado River Basin, an important opportunity for his career, but one that would require extensive travel throughout the Southwest. I don't have to take it, he said, as we discussed the offer over dinner at my place, the windows open to catch the evening breeze that carried the scent of ponderosa pines. There will be other projects, so of course you have to take it, I countered, though the thought of 3 months with only occasional visits left a hollow feeling in my chest. It's exactly the kind of work you've been wanting to do. But we've just found our rhythm, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. 3 months is a long time. We have phones, weekends when you're within driving distance. I squeezed his fingers. I'm not going anywhere, Chase. He studied me for a long moment, his expression serious. Promise me something? What's that? That you won't use the time to talk yourself out of us. His insight into my tendencies was unnerving sometimes. That you won't start making lists of all the reasons this shouldn't work. I felt exposed. My natural inclination toward cautious analysis laid bare. Is that what you think I'll do? I think, he said carefully, that you're still learning to trust this, to trust us. And distance can make the doubts seem louder than the certainties. He wasn't wrong. Even as our relationship had deepened, even as I'd begun to allow myself to imagine a shared future, there remained a part of me, shaped by past disappointment and cultural messaging about age-appropriate relationships, that kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I promise, I said finally, meaning it. No talking myself out of the best thing that's happened to me in years. The goodbye when he left for the project was harder than I'd anticipated. Standing in my driveway at dawn, wrapped in his embrace, I felt a surge of emotion that surprised me with its intensity. It's just 3 months, I said, as much to convince myself as him. We'll talk every day. Every day, he agreed, his arms tightening around me. And I'll send you footage of the most beautiful cloud formations I find. Such a romantic, I teased, trying to lighten the moment despite the heaviness in my chest. Only with you, he said before kissing me, with a thoroughness that left me breathless. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to our relationship. Daily video calls became our lifeline, Chase showing me the landscapes he was documenting, me sharing weather patterns that might affect his shooting conditions. On weekends, when his location allowed, I would drive to meet him, sometimes staying in cheap motels, other times camping under the stars when weather permitted. There was something oddly strengthening about the separation. Without the immediate physical presence that had been such a powerful aspect of our connection, we were forced to develop other dimensions of our relationship, talking more deeply about our histories, our values, our hopes for the future. 2 months into his project, during a weekend rendezvous at a small lodge near the north rim of the Grand Canyon, Chase brought up something we'd been circling but not directly addressing. I've been thinking about what happens when this project ends, he said, as we sat on the lodge's porch after dinner, watching lightning play across distant thunderheads, a spectacular monsoon season display. About us, about the distance. My heart beat faster, uncertainty flooding through me. Was this the beginning of the end? Had the separation shown him that our relationship wasn't worth the geographical complications? What have you been thinking? I asked, striving to keep my voice neutral. He turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his. I've been thinking that I'm tired of saying goodbye to you, that I want to wake up with you more than just occasionally. His thumb traced patterns on my palm. I've been thinking about moving to Flagstaff. The proposal caught me completely off guard. But your house, I managed. Your work. My house can be rented out or sold, he said simply. And my work is flexible. There's plenty to document around Flagstaff, and it's actually more central for many of the projects I do throughout the state. His expression grew more serious. Unless you think it's too soon? Or you're not ready for that kind of change? I took a deep breath, trying to sort through the rush of emotions his suggestion had triggered. Fear, certainly. The persistent anxiety that allowing someone so completely into my life again might lead to the same kind of pain I'd experienced before. But also a profound joy, a sense of rightness that transcended the logical arguments my scientific mind wanted to make. It's not too soon, I said finally, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Not if it's what you really want. Linda, he said, my name like a caress in his mouth. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. 2 weeks ago, Chase returned from his Colorado River project with a collection of stunning footage, a renewed passion for environmental advocacy, and a U-Haul trailer containing the essentials of his life. The rest of his belongings will follow once his house in Sedona is rented to a fellow environmental photographer next month. For now, we're navigating the complex choreography of combining two independent lives, finding space for his equipment in my home office, rearranging furniture to accommodate both our needs, learning the daily rhythms of sharing space after years of solitary living. It's not without challenges. We've had disagreements about everything from thermostat settings to coffee brewing methods, moments of irritation when personal habits collide unexpectedly. But there have also been moments of such profound rightness that they take my breath away. Waking to find Chase already up, filming the sunrise from our back deck. Coming home from the weather station to discover he's prepared dinner, music playing softly as he moves around my kitchen. Our kitchen, with easy familiarity. Watching thunderstorms roll across the San Francisco peaks from our porch swing, his arm around my shoulders as we predict lightning strikes and rainfall amounts with equal enthusiasm. Last night, as we lay in bed listening to a summer rain pattering against the roof, Chase propped himself up on one elbow to look at me, his expression thoughtful in the dim light. "Do you remember what you said about weather systems having personalities?" he asked. "That first day in your office?" I nodded, curious where he was going with this. "Nah, I've been thinking about us in those terms," he continued, his fingers tracing idle patterns on my arm. "About what kind of weather system we'd be." The meteorologist in me couldn't resist. "And what's your conclusion, Mr. Duvall?" His smile was slow, tender. "I think we're like a perfectly balanced front, where cool reason meets warm passion, where the pressure gradient is just right to create something sustainable but never stagnant." His hand settled over mine. "The kind of system that meteorologists look at and think, that's going to be around for a long, long time." The poetry of his analogy, so perfectly suited to the language of my profession and my heart, filled me with a joy so complete I couldn't speak for a moment. Instead, I leaned forward to kiss him, trying to convey through touch what words couldn't adequately express. This relationship isn't what I expected in my midlife years. It's better, richer, more challenging, and more rewarding than anything I could have imagined when Chase first walked into my weather station a year ago. There are still moments when doubt creeps in, when I catch myself wondering if the differences in our ages will eventually matter more than they do now, when I worry about the future in ways that have more to do with my past wounds than our present reality. But then I remember what I tell my viewers during monsoon season in Arizona, that weather is ultimately about energy patterns, about the interaction of forces that create something greater than their individual parts. That prediction is possible, but never perfect, that some uncertainty is inherent in any system. What I've learned with Chase is that the same is true of love, that it operates according to natural laws, but retains an element of beautiful mystery, that it requires both scientific understanding and surrender to forces beyond our control. that sometimes the most accurate prediction comes not from computers and calculations, but from listening to the quiet voice within that recognizes patterns of rightness, of belonging, of home. As a meteorologist, I've spent my career helping people prepare for whatever might come from the sky. As a woman in love with a man who films the earth from above, I'm learning to embrace the uncertainty of our particular forecast. Sunny with occasional challenges, conditions favorable for long-term stability, and a 100% chance of continued wonder at finding, in my middle years, the perfect atmospheric conditions for my heart to finally bloom.